Let's start with a question that feels philosophical, but is actually purely biological. I mean, is your brain a democracy? Because we like to imagine this collaborative, utopian workspace where every single neuron has a vote.
Yeah, it's a nice thought. We tend to personify our biology a lot.
Exactly. But if you actually look at the architecture, the literal wiring, is it a democracy where the mailroom clerk has the exact same shouting power as the CEO? Or is there this rigid top-down hierarchy? Because how you answer that changes, well, basically everything about how we understand thought and consciousness.
And neuroscience has been trying to draw that specific organizational chart for decades. I mean, the answer, based on the research we're covering today, is that democracy is definitely the wrong word. It's a hierarchy, a very steep, very specific kind of hierarchy.
Right, so to understand who is actually in charge up there, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating paper. This was published in Nature Communications in April 2025. It's from the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics, and the title is, it's a bit of a mouthful, Stimulation Mapping and Whole Brain Modeling Reveal Gradients of Excitability and Recurrence in Cortical Networks.
That is quite the academic mouthful, yeah.
It is. But our mission today is to essentially deconstruct this paper. We are going to explain every concept, every mechanism, because what the lead authors have done here is map the physics of thought. They've figured out why some parts of your brain react instantly to the outside world and why others seem to just ignore the world and talk to themselves.
Which sounds dysfunctional when you phrase it like that, but as we'll see, that talking to yourself part, that might literally be the physical basis of human consciousness.
Okay, so let's orient the listener here. If the brain is a massive corporation, we need to know who works where. The authors talk about this concept called a principal gradient. Can you break that down for us? What are we looking at?
Think of the principal gradient as the main axis of the brain's organization. Just imagine a long ladder. Now, at the bottom of the ladder, you have what the paper calls low-order networks. In technical terms, these are unimodal regions.
Unimodal, meaning one mode, like one specific job.
Precisely. These are the sensory processors. So the visual network, the somatomotor network, their job is raw data ingestion. Light hits the retina, the visual network fires. You touch a hot stove, the motor network pulls your hand back. They are completely grounded in the immediate physical present.
Okay, so that's the mailroom. They're just sorting the physical packages coming in from the outside world. They don't care about the big picture. So who is at the top of the ladder?
At the other end, the top of the gradient, you have the high-order networks, or the transmodal regions. These include the famous default mode network and the frontoparietal network.
Right, the executives.
The executives, exactly. Transmodal means they aren't tied to one specific sense. They don't just see or hear. They integrate. They take the report from the mailroom, remember a relevant memory from 3 years ago, worry about a future outcome, and then decide on a strategy. They handle abstract thought, introspection, all of that complex planning.
So the core question of this study was, do the physics of these neurons actually match that corporate job description? Does the CEO actually look different electrically than the mailroom clerk?
And to answer that, they couldn't just put people in an MRI scanner and take a picture. MRI is correlational. It shows us what lights up when you think, thanks to blood flow. But it doesn't tell us the mechanics of how it lights up. To get that, they had to get invasive. This study uses a perturbational approach.
Which is, I think, a very polite scientific way of saying they literally poked the brain with a stick.
A very fancy electrified stick, yes. They used intracerebral electrical stimulation, or IES. And they worked with 36 patients who were already undergoing surgery prep for drug-resistant epilepsy. This is key because it gave them a rare ethical clearance to place electrodes deep inside the living brain tissue.
Right. This is what caught my eye about the methodology. They didn't just passively record what the brain was doing naturally. They zapped a specific spot, like ringing a doorbell, and then watched to see who answered and how loud they answered.
But here is the critical nuance that makes this paper so special. They watched from 2 different angles simultaneously. They had sensors deep inside the brain right next to the zap, which is called CG, or stereotactic EEG. But they also had high-density EEG caps on the patient's scalp, recording the global reaction at the exact same time.
So to stick with the house analogy, they rang the doorbell in a specific room, say the visual cortex. They had a microphone in that room to hear the ring, but they also had people standing out on the street to see if the windows rattled across the whole house.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. They wanted to see the local reaction and the global ripple effect. And they did this 323 distinct times. They rang the doorbell in the visual center, then the motor center, then the executive suite, and meticulously compared the echoes.
Okay, we're about 5 minutes in, so let's pause and do our first recap to really lock this in before we look at the empirical results.
It sounds good. Let's break it down into 3 quick bullet points. Point 1, the brain is a hierarchy. It goes from unimodal sensory networks, our mailroom, up to transmodal cognitive networks, the executives.
Right.
Point 2, to map this out, researchers used a perturbational method. They zapped the brain with electricity to force a reaction. And point 3, they recorded that reaction from both the inside using depth electrodes and the outside using scalp EEG simultaneously to capture the full picture.
Perfect. And here is an interactive question for you, the listener. If you were designing a brain from scratch, would you want the visual center, the part that sees a tiger jumping out of the bushes at you, to be chatting with every other department constantly? Or would you want it to just do its job instantly and quietly? Keep that in mind, because the results essentially answer that exact design question.
Yeah, it's really the difference between a reflex and a reflection.
So let's get into the data. Section 2 of our deep dive, the gradient of excitability. They zapped these different networks along the ladder. What exactly were they measuring when they recorded the response?
They measured something called global mean field power, or GMFP. In simple terms, think of this as the overall loudness or the total energy of the brain's reaction. When they stimulated a single spot, how much energy did the whole brain generate in response across all those EEG channels?
And they didn't just get a disorganized blob of noise. They found a very specific, repeatable timeline, a sequence of events.
Yes, across the board, they saw 3 distinct peaks in the electrical response. Peak 1 happens at about 40 milliseconds. That's the immediate, ouch, I've been poked reaction. Peak 2 is around 80 milliseconds. That's the signal just starting to travel locally to neighboring regions. And then peak 3 is the game changer. That happens around 370 milliseconds.
370 milliseconds. I mean, that is nearly half a second. In brain time, where individual neurons fire in single milliseconds, a response at 370 is basically an eternity.
It truly is. And this is exactly where the gradient revealed itself. When they zapped the low-order networks, so the visual cortex or motor cortex, the overall reaction was relatively quiet and very fast. It peaked early at that 40 millisecond mark and then just silence. The signal died out almost immediately.
So the mailroom guy looks up, blinks, sorts the letter, and immediately goes back to work. No drama.
Exactly. But when they moved the electrode and stimulated the high-order networks, specifically the default mode network, that late response at 370 milliseconds was massive. The signal didn't die out. It grew. It reverberated. It lasted for hundreds of milliseconds.
The paper calls this excitability. I want to be really clear on that term, because usually in everyday language, we think of excitable as being anxious or hyperactive.
Right. In this neurophysiological context, excitability refers to the network's tendency to amplify and sustain a signal over time. The researchers use a really helpful analogy here. Imagine throwing a pebble into water.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
If you throw a pebble into a shallow, muddy puddle, that's the low-order network, plop. The ripples die instantly, the mud just absorbs all the energy.
With high-order networks.
Imagine throwing that same pebble into a vast, deep canyon with hard stone walls. You throw it and you get this massive echo that bounces back and forth. The high-order networks are literally designed to be echo chambers.
So the top executives in our brain corporation are essentially spending all day working in an echo chamber.
And for once, an echo chamber is a biologically good thing. Think about why. If you're trying to solve a complex math problem, or plan out your retirement, or just understand the nuance of this deep dive, you need to hold on to that information. You need to manipulate it in your working memory. You can't have it vanish in 40 milliseconds like a flash of light. You need it to echo so you can examine it from different angles.
That makes intuitive sense. The sensory stuff needs to be fast and disposable. I don't need to remember the specific photon that hit my eye 5 seconds ago. I just need to dodge the incoming baseball. But the abstract concept of a brain hierarchy, that needs to stick around in my head.
Exactly. High excitability in those transmodal regions allows for what we call temporal integration. It bridges the gap of time so thoughts can actually form.
So we have the map. Mailroom is fast, local, quiet. Executives are slow, global, loud. But the part of this paper that really elevates it is the mechanism. Because knowing that a phenomenon happens is one thing. Knowing exactly why it happens physically is another entirely.
This is where we leave the wetware of the biology and enter the software. The researchers basically ask, what is the exact physical mechanism causing that canyon to echo? And to find out, they built a digital twin of the brain.
This sounds like straight-up science fiction. Explain the whole brain modeling they used here.
They use a computational framework called the Janssen-Ritt model. Now, don't let the name intimidate you. It's essentially a mathematical way of simulating an entire population of neurons. It doesn't just simulate one generic cell. It simulates the excitatory pyramidal cells, the inhibitory interneurons, and calculates exactly how they regulate each other based on known neurobiology.
So they took the actual wiring diagrams of these specific patients' brains, like the white matter tracts they scanned with MRI, and they built a custom computer simulation that behaved exactly like that real person's brain.
Correct. They plugged the math into the specific individual anatomy of each patient. So they have this digital brain that, when you mathematically zap it in the simulation, outputs the exact same wiggly EEG lines as the real living brain did in the hospital bed.
And because it's a computer simulation, they can do something you can never ever do in a living human. They performed a virtual dissection.
This is honestly the coolest part of the study. They wanted to test the importance of recurrent feedback.
Recurrence, that means loops, right?
Yeah.
Signals going back and forth.
Yes. In a simple linear circuit, A talks to B. In a recurrent circuit, A talks to B, but then B also talks back to A. It's a continuous conversation. The researchers hypothesized that the high-order networks are loud and echoey, specifically because the rest of the brain is actively shouting back at them.
So to test this hypothesis, they went into the simulation code and mathematically severed the connections coming back into the stimulated area.
Yes, they forced the network to listen only to itself. It could send signals out to the rest of the brain, but it couldn't hear the reply. They completely cut the feedback loop.
And what happened when they cut those virtual wires?
The results were stark, and they tell us basically everything about how the brain is built. When they did this virtual dissection to the low-order networks, the visual cortex, nothing changed.
Wait, nothing?
Almost nothing. The simulated EEG signal looked exactly the same as the real one. This proves that sensory networks are completely segregated, they work locally, they rely entirely on their own internal machinery. They don't need the CEO's permission or anyone else's input to process a sudden flash of light.
That makes perfect sense for survival. You want the mailroom to keep functioning even if the phone lines to the executive suite are completely down.
But when they perform this exact same virtual cut on the high-order networks, the default mode network, the signal totally collapsed. That massive late response, that canyon echo at 370 milliseconds, it just disappeared.
Wow. So the echo isn't coming from inside the room.
No, the echo is the feedback. This definitively proves that high-order networks depend on integration. The executive isn't loud because they personally have a megaphone. They are loud because the entire rest of the company is in the meeting room shouting back at them.
That is a profound distinction. Segregation for the raw senses, integration for complex thoughts.
It basically says that complexity, what we consider higher human thought, is an emergent property of the network's connectedness, not just a property of a smarter individual cell.
Let's take a breath. That was the heavy lifting of the paper.
Yeah.
Time for our second recap at the 12-minute mark. Let's solidify this mechanism before we talk about what it means for us.
Let's do it. Point 1, high-order cognitive networks have a late response, an echo. Point 2, to find out why, researchers built a computational Janssen-Ritt model of each patient's unique brain. Point 3, they performed a virtual dissection by mathematically cutting the feedback loops in that model. And point 4, the result. Sensory networks are segregated, meaning they don't need feedback to work. Cognitive networks are integrated, meaning they completely collapse without that global feedback.
So here's the interactive moment for you listening right now.
Yeah.
I want you to try something to feel this in action. Look at something bright in the room you're in, a lamp or a window. You see it instantly, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is your segregated visual network doing its job locally. Now, I want you to close your eyes and try to explain to yourself why that lamp is there. Who bought it? How much did it cost? Do you even like it?
You can physically feel the difference in a cognitive effort, can't you?
Well, you really can. That mental effort, that feeling of your brain churning through context, that is literally the recruitment of those global recurrent feedback loops. You are actively trying to get the canyon to echo. The biology perfectly mirrors the subjective experience.
And that leads us directly into the so what of it all. Why does knowing about these gradients and feedback loops matter for anyone who isn't a clinical neuroscientist?
That's section 4, the implications. Let's talk about clinical applications first. Neuromodulation is huge right now in medicine.
It is. We're talking about things like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's becoming a very standard FDA-approved treatment for severe depression.
Right, this is where they put a magnetic coil against your scalp to stimulate the brain tissue underneath. And usually, for depression, they target the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Which is a high-order transmodal region. Now think about what we just learned from the virtual dissection. This specific region relies almost entirely on global integration.
So if you zap that area with a magnet, the therapeutic effect isn't just happening right there under the coil.
Exactly. This study implies that if you are stimulating a high-order region, the actual therapeutic effect is completely dependent on the global health of the brain's connections. You aren't just treating a local spot, you're actively trying to jumpstart a massive global loop.
So if the wiring to that region is damaged, say the white matter tracts are degraded due to aging or trauma, or if the rest of the brain just isn't talking back efficiently,
then the treatment might completely fail. The echo simply won't happen. The signal will collapse locally, just like it did in the virtual dissection model.
contrast that with treating a localized motor issue.
Right. If you're doing physical rehab for a stroke victim and trying to get a paralyzed hand to move again, you're targeting the motor cortex. That's a low-order, segregated network. This study suggests that for motor issues, you can focus almost entirely on the local circuit. You don't really need to worry as much about whether the prefrontal cortex is effectively chatting with the parietal lobe.
It really suggests we've been using a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach to brain stimulation. We've been treating the mailroom and the boardroom with the exact same strategy, hoping for the best.
And this research gives us a concrete roadmap to tailor those treatments. Doctors need to know, are we fixing a segregated local circuit, or are we trying to repair a global integrated loop? The intervention has to match the gradient.
This also heavily touches on the big philosophical one, the C word, consciousness.
It does. There's a leading framework in neuroscience called the global workspace theory. The basic idea is that for a piece of information to become conscious, for you to be explicitly aware of it, it has to be broadcast to the entire brain.
So if the mailroom receives a package, but just files it away and doesn't tell anyone, the corporation as a whole doesn't know about it.
Exactly. The visual cortex absolutely sees the tiger in your peripheral vision, but you don't consciously know there's a tiger until that visual signal travels up the principal gradient and gets globally integrated by the high-order networks.
And this study basically provides the hard physical evidence for that broadcast system.
It strongly suggests that the gradient of excitability we've been talking about is the actual physical infrastructure of consciousness. The specific mechanism that turns a raw sensory signal into a sustained conscious thought is that recurrent feedback loop.
Now, we should mention the limitations of the paper, just to be scientifically rigorous here. We're talking about data gathered from epilepsy patients.
Yes, that is a very crucial caveat. All 36 patients had drug-resistant epilepsy. Now, while the researchers were extremely careful to only analyze electrodes placed in healthy, non-epileptogenic tissue, these are still brains dealing with a severe chronic pathology. Their overall wiring might have adapted or compensated over the years in ways a healthy brain simply hasn't.
And what about the computational model, the Jansen-Ritt framework?
Well, it's a model, and all models are inherent simplifications of reality. Real neurons have complex neurotransmitter dynamics, gene expression, glial cells supporting them. The model simplifies a lot of that messy biology into clean mathematical equations.
But the fact that it works so well.
Exactly. The fact that the virtual dissection predicted the signal collapse so perfectly suggests they are really onto the fundamental math of the system. It's a coarse-grained model, sure, but it clearly captures the essential rules of the road for how the brain moves information.
So let's bring it all home. We started this deep dive with the concept of the corporation.
The brain as a corporation, right?
We found out it is definitely not a democracy. It's a highly structured system where the entry-level employees, the sensory networks, work fast, locally, and almost entirely independently. They are strictly segregated.
And the executives, the high-order cognitive networks, are slow, deliberate, and completely dependent on constant feedback from everyone else. They are wholly integrated.
And that dependency, that 370 millisecond echo, is what actually allows for this staggering complexity of human thought. It's what allows us to hold an abstract concept in our mind's eye and turn it over.
Honestly, it changes how I view my own focus. It's not just a fleeting state of mind, it's a literal physical state of network
I
recurrence.
want to leave the listener with a final, slightly provocative thought to take away. We've talked about how high-level thought requires this constant, massive feedback loop, the canyon echo.
Right.
What happens when those loops are just slightly out of sync? We know the timing is incredibly precise. Peaks at 40, 80, and 370 milliseconds. What if the global feedback arrives, say, 10 or 20 milliseconds too late?
That is a fascinating question.
Could that slight timing delay in the echo be the actual physical mechanism behind things like ADHD? Or that feeling of brain fog where you just can't hold on to a thought?
It makes a lot of logical sense. If the boardroom can't hear the mailroom clearly because of a slight delay or static on the line, the entire corporation becomes disorganized and inefficient.
Or even deeper than that, the feeling of the self. If the self is essentially just the brain talking to itself via these massive recurrent loops, what happens when the loop distorts?
You're suggesting that who we are, our core identity, is maintained moment to moment by the stability of that late response echo.
It's definitely something to mull over the next time you're trying to concentrate on a task and you feel your mind wandering. Is the loop simply breaking?
Stay curious.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep neurological excavation. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.